Damage, tanking, and healing, the divine equation of MMO gameplay. This formula of combat has existed in many forms, flavors, and flares across the genre, and can often be easily identified. Group-based games require that leading knight, a person to gain the control over the enemies and situation, the armada of deadly fighters to melt down foes, and the healers who are responsible for supporting the team more directly by keeping them alive or shielding them from certain death. I could play dumb and say that, for whatever reason, this seems to just work, but I and many of us know why it works. Structure. A familiar structure that seems to scratch any of the itches that us MMO players have. But what happens when this formula of DPS, tanking, and healing is disturbed in an MMO with group-based combat? Enter the history of Guild Wars 2's design around group content. Back before Guild Wars 2 officially released, the marketing around the game's combat systems was that of advertising the game as a great innovator in the genre. Guild Wars 2 went in a direction of using skill-based abilities where they needed to be aimed, charged, and where reaction timing was everything. Another unique system that, till this day, shines as being rather novel is Guild Wars 2's combo field function, which in theory compels players to cooperate and recognize when certain effects are on the battlefield and then use skills to combo or alter their abilities altogether. All of the messaging around combat was really hyping up the fans, and while some of the ideas fell a little flat in execution, it was all delivered in the final product. But one point of marketing during the press tours of Guild Wars 2 caused quite the conversation. This being the messaging that, in Guild Wars 2, you can play the way you want to play, and that no one will be standing around waiting for a healer.
Any situation.
When you're out in the world adventuring, it doesn't matter who you run into. If you all are playing the same profession, you can still all play together.
Anyone can be a support character. Anyone can be a damage dealer. A thief can become a really good tank with all of his evasion capabilities against really slow hitting opponents.
It has the action of a shooter, the strategy of an RTS, and the depth of an MMO. The combat in Guild Wars 2 is unlike any other game.
This news was both exciting for some and concerning for others. The message essentially said, if you want to play damage, you can build damage. If you want to play a tank, which back in the day was often referred to as control, you can build a tank. And if you want to play a healer, which was referred to as support, you can build with healing/support in mind. Which at face value sounds absolutely amazing. To be able to have so much control over your gameplay experience is a huge aspect that draws players in. However, astute players would then gravitate towards the second half of that marketing and begin to question the integrity of the initial statement. You won't be waiting around for a healer? Huh. Well, as a player who often plays and builds in the direction of support/healer, this statement was, and is, quite concerning. Come to find out on launch of Guild Wars 2 that if you were not building and running pure DPS glass cannon builds, you were doing it all wrong. Tanking and healing playstyles were not only extremely weak in potency, but they were truly never incentivized or needed in boss/encounter design. The early marketing wasn't kidding. You really were not waiting around for a healer, or even a tank, because there was nothing for healers and tanks to do. So, while you technically could build into these roles of gameplay, you had no reason to exist in the culture of PvE. Back in the day, there were times where I was on the receiving end of critical private messages and whispers from other players saying that I was doing it all wrong and hindering the group's progression. I can't precisely remember an example, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were instances where I was even kicked for not playing a DPS and was, instead playing a support guardian, as I always do. This early design of Guild Wars 2 created a power vacuum, quite literally. What players might expect when interacting with an MMO, with the Holy Trinity system, was stripped down to one pillar of gameplay: damage. The gameplay experience was faster paced in and of itself, but when looking at it from a group perspective, it was mind-numbingly boring. It was like being promised a bowl of Lucky Charms. Except someone drained all the milk, plucked out all the marshmallows, and shattered the bowl on the ground. Sure, you have the dry cereal left all over the floor, so you have to be active and pick them all up. But once you take the time to appreciate the flavor of the dry cereal, you end up getting really bored of it after a while. Let's just say there was a little bit of a problem with this design, and come Guild Wars 2's first expansion, Heart of Thorns, it seemed like the developers agreed that change was necessary. In Heart of Thorns, the trait system was reformatted into the specialization system, and elite specializations were the route developers would take to continue to expand and grow on the classes. A few of these elite specs sought to double down and highlight the function of support/healing in Guild Wars 2. A few of these specs that come to mind would be the Herald, the Tempest, and the Druid. The Druid was the final elite spec to be revealed and was the most public showing of prioritized healing. Almost all the abilities and traits had something to do with supporting your friends, be it through healing, boons, or direct damage buffs. And as for tanking playstyles, they also gave it some more love, and appeared to be going in an interesting direction as they introduced a new condition which many MMO players might recognize, this being Taunt. Taunt as a condition allowed the applier to gain aggro control over the target for its duration, forcing attacks to land around them and the pathing of enemies to follow the taunter. The difficult integration of this, however, was that it was a condition that was not split away from PvP and World vs. World, and worked the same way against other players, making it a very difficult condition to balance. This severely limited the amount of skills that could apply Taunt, and on launch of Heart of Thorns, only 2 abilities applied Taunt. Another issue was that, since it is a condition, it does not work against bosses or mobs that have a Defiance bar, meaning tanking in PvE group content such as dungeons, fractals, and raids would not be achieved through taunting. This condition, Taunt, is one of the rarest effects to still exist in Guild Wars 2. Guild Wars 2 Heart of Thorns did not stop there though. While the game moved in a direction which granted more build flexibility around these roles, there still needed to be a reason to run these roles. Enter Heart of Thorns level difficulty and the new endgame mode of raids. Heart of Thorns was a much more dangerous expansion, where enemies brought the heat and players were more incentivized to stick together in groups to heal and peel for each other. Additionally, the new mode of raids challenged players like they had never been challenged before. Bosses pumped out higher amounts of damage, and mechanics required everyone to stay on their toes. This means that healers really did have a place in Heart of Thorns, and were even necessary to clear content. When looking at those who wish to play tanks, one might wonder how they went about this with Taunt not affecting bosses. Well, they designed bosses to aggro onto the player with the most toughness, and stick to them throughout the fight. This means that by collecting gear with the toughness stat, players could slot themselves into the tank role by simply existing in combat. Heart of Thorns finally ushered the game into an era which more appropriately fit the divine formula of the Holy Trinity. As the game progressed to its second expansion and beyond, the overall group compositions remained diverse enough to keep things exciting and fresh. But the effectiveness of certain roles began to grow too strong, and other roles slowly slipped back into irrelevancy. The game's second expansion, Path of Fire, changed the game for healers and supports, and the overall potency of this support design had pivotal impacts on future content. With the second expansion, Barrier was introduced on the Scourge specialization for Necromancer, and acted as the game's first shielding mechanic, providing overhealth for allies. This made players much more durable, and was more effective on targets with increased vitality, otherwise known as health. Scourge also excelled with Necromancer's core support abilities, which allowed for the strongest resurrection builds. Along with Scourge and Barrier, the Firebrand, the Guardian's elite specialization, bloated the support category to the point of nearly exploding. Firebrand's design allowed for the strongest and easiest method of supporting allies, having abilities that had insane reach, over-tuned healing skills, and utility skills that functioned with little preparation needed while providing sought-after boons. This era of support was particularly deadly for other classes seeking to play the role of healer or supporter. Tanking also began to wane in its role. Taunt was only given to 2 more abilities, and even at the time of writing this, only 4 abilities apply Taunt. Additionally, more and more bosses moved away from the aggro being decided by the player with the most toughness. More encounters got rid of the traditional idea of the tank altogether, and would just have bosses aggro onto players randomly and change the aggro throughout the fight. Players who spent time procuring gear that had toughness attached to it would soon highly regret their investments. And to quickly point out about damage has always been, and still continues to be, a very solid and interesting role, so DPS players tend to be very comfortable. And now we come to more modern days with Guild Wars 2's 3rd expansion, End of Dragons. Healers continue to receive love with more classes getting access to necessary boons, which has increased class diversity in groups, and the new system of allied target healing abilities has come into the game, allowing for new roads to go down for playing a healer. Tanks, however, they are all but forgotten. What was once a game where toughness held value is now a game where you are possibly playing at a disadvantage by building toughness into your gear for PvE. Tanking is now utterly randomized. Aggro is not a mechanic, or aggro is proximity-based and can swap to whomever is closest. On top of toughness losing its aggro mechanic, many traits and classes highly value players building more vitality into their gear as the go-to method of improving survivability. Vitality is now connected to many buffs via class traits, and also allows supports who apply barrier to apply more, and really pad out for those big damage moments. Additionally, the way the endgame works with strike missions is that many attacks can be easily avoided just by jumping. Yeah, not even dodge rolling. And if you and your team are being hit by a raid mechanic, it usually doesn't just do a lot of damage which needs to be healed, it usually fully kills players. So there really is little to no reason to build toughness anymore. The choice to have so many instant kill or instant down mechanics in strikes has also had a negative impact on support classes again. Healing is rarely an active part of PvE combat anymore, and is all about rezzing players as fast as possible, thus indirectly buffing res builds like Scourge. Yet again, Scourge really pulling out the big guns. Funnily enough, the classic Holy Trinity in itself has become overly complicated as well, and this is in part thanks to the expansion's decision to limit almost all ally-affecting skills to only 5 targets, when raids and strike missions are groups of 10 players. Such a change now requires players to essentially double up on almost all support-based systems, and has turned the idea of a trinity into more of a pentagram with every encounter. 2 boons have been socially decided as being always necessary, these being alacrity and quickness. These boons are provided through various classes and various roles. So now, with such strict guidelines on how a squad functions, which is essentially just 2 parties of 5 players operating in the same space, players now have to think of DPS, healers, alacrity and quickness providers, and to a lesser extent, control/tanks. And while certain roles can double up on these responsibilities, for example a DPS providing alacrity, it seems to funnel those players into a hyper-focused mindset that they have to be providing these boons at 100% uptime, or heaven forbid, the social repercussions of getting called out for not having it always rolling on your party of 5, and thus not performing as well on the DPS meters. And that is where we currently are at in Guild Wars 2's relationship with the Holy Trinity. It feels like it has turned into a pentagram. It is a little unfortunate that Guild Wars 2 started out with the idea of having a game where you wouldn't be sitting around waiting for that healer, then progressed to a game which more so resembled other MMOs, and now has their endgame PvE experience bogged down by so many specific requirements needing to be fulfilled. For a game that wanted to avoid those queue and wait times, I can safely say that I have done the most waiting around and migraine-inducing micromanagement of party compositions in Guild Wars 2 End of Dragons than I have in any other previous expansion. With this said, I would love to see what Guild Wars 2 would feel like if those support/healer effects were not limited to 5 targets, and were instead balanced around the 10 people within a squad. As it is right now, a squad doesn't really feel much like a cooperative squad experience, and instead feels like there happens to be 2 groups of people just doing the same content. Additionally, I have to give my condolences to those who wish to play a tank in Guild Wars 2's PvE experience. There really isn't a reason for tanks to exist in group compositions. But I don't believe that nothing can be done on this front. I would love to see toughness and taunt tanking make a comeback, and for the stat of toughness, to scale the amount of defiance damage your hard CC skills do to break bars. This, in effect, would really slot tank characters into that stronger control role. Guild Wars 2 always travels down the road of reinventing or reimagining the wheel, and that mentality is extremely useful when crafting video games. However, it can come back to bite you from time to time, and overall, Guild Wars 2's journey with the Holy Trinity is one that can be summarized as being rocky, and still seems to be finding its footing. I hope that with this renewed direction of PvE content, the game continues to see updates with their systems, to have something that is a bit more trustworthy and standardized. Thank you so very much for watching. If you care to try Guild Wars 2 for free, or purchase the expansions, I have links below courtesy of ArenaNet. Thank you so very much for watching and experiencing this video. Comment below your thoughts about Guild Wars 2's relationship with the Holy Trinity system. Did you happen to prefer vanilla Guild Wars 2? Did you think Heart of Thorns was the perfect sweet spot? Did you have as many critical comments about Path of Fire's balance as I do? And how do you feel about End of Dragons right now? I would love to hear and comment and discuss with you down below. Like, comment, subscribe, and do all of that YouTube stuff. And I will catch you all in the next video. Bye, everyone. Mwah.